Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 5 game from the Marshall GM Invitational. Now, if you followed the last video, you know that I lost a really tough game against Grandmaster Leonid Udasin in round 4, and in this one I was hoping to recover with the white pieces. My opponent in this one was International Master Victor Shen, who is a very, very solid player and pretty difficult to beat. He's just a very resilient defender, and he's not as active a player nowadays than he was before. I think he's working full time in finance now, and that takes up most of his time. But still, a very formidable opponent. I was mildly familiar with his type of play because I'd played him a few times before when I was much younger, and so I kind of had an idea of what to look out for, and I tried to put some of that knowledge to use in this game. Anyways, I opened with d4. Victor played d5, knight f3, knight f6, and e3. And the reason I went for this move order is I knew that Victor was a Slav player. I knew he tended to prefer like Slavs or semi-Slavs. And so with this move e3, I was trying to get some intel on what line of the Slav he wanted to play. Because if he played e6, it told me that maybe he wants to play a semi-Slav with c6. And if he plays c6 first, it would tell me, well, maybe he wants the bishop outside the chain right away. So it was a way for me to understand what type of Slav line he wants to play without committing to c4. Now, he played neither of those moves and instead went bishop g4. And this was a little bit of a surprise to me because it's a very unusual move that you develop the bishop outside of the chain before moving your c or e pawn. I decided to challenge this bishop right away by playing h3 because if bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, I get a bishop pair, and, well, we know how I feel about those. So I decided to just challenge it right away. And Victor played bishop h5. And now I notice there's a nice, interesting nuance that I could go for with g4. Point being is that after bishop g6, which happened, I went knight e5 and decided to hunt down this bishop as soon as possible. And the nice thing about this is that you might say, well, what about bishop e4? Isn't that an option? Challenging my rook. Well, it is, except I have f3, and then the bishop is just forced back. And you might say, well, isn't this diagonal weakened? Well, it is, but it can't really be taken advantage of yet. And now I can hunt down the bishop further with h4. And the issue in this position is that I'm actually threatening to trap the bishop with h5, and there's only one way to prevent that from happening, which is to move the h-pawn. But if you make a move like h6 or h5, I actually can take on g6, and after f takes g6, the light squares in black's camp are super weak, and this pawn is a massive target. And even after a move like queen d3, the game is nearly over because I'm playing queen takes g6 with check, and I have all these amazing advantages in the position. And playing a move like king f7 is not what you want to play here. So because of that, it actually turns out that bishop e4 is not a good move, and that this bishop is really just getting hunted down. Black thought for a long time trying to figure out how to deal with this because, again, my threat is not to take right away. My threat's to play h4 and hunt it down. And black decided to go knight f d7. The point of this move is that if I actually do play h4, now after knight takes e5, d takes e5, now black can get away with playing h5 because this knight is no longer challenging the bishop. And so after like a move like g5, black can go like e6, and the bishop is secure on this diagonal. So knight of d7 does kind of challenge my knight and force me to take. But I'm very, very happy with this transaction because I basically got the bishop pair on move 7 with, for nothing pretty much. So I think white has a decent advantage. Now you might say I pushed these pawns around my king, but it's actually not such a huge factor because these pawns are well protected right now with my queen and rook. And there might be some scenarios where my bishop goes to g2 and almost replaces the g-pawn as a protector of my king. And then perhaps these pawns become actually a source of space on the king side. So anyways, now that I have the two bishops, I want to, take advantage of them, open up the position. So I went for c4, opening up the position, challenging the pawn on d5. Black went c6, and I went knight c3, again putting more pressure on this d5 point with this pawn and knight. And then black went for e6. And, I was pretty happy here because, again, I'm taking a lot of space. I have the bishop here already. Things are going well. I went bishop d2. It might seem a little bit strange to develop the bishop here, but I want to, get my rooks connected as quickly as possible, and putting the bishop on b2 behind this wall of pawns doesn't make a whole lot of sense here. So d2 seems more natural. And black went queen b6, challenging this pawn on b2. Now, this is a typical normal move in the Slav, putting the pressure on the b2 pawn. It happens all the time. A lot of times you go queen b3 to neutralize it, and then there's this tension with queen b3 and queen b6 where neither side really wants to take because you give the rook the open file. So I've been in many situations where there's a stare down on the b file like this. But I actually thought I had better because I decided to go c5. And my point was that this b2 pawn is not really, a good idea. It's not a good idea to capture because if you go queen takes b2, at the very least I have rook b1. And rook takes b7, recovering my pawn with the queen in a very precarious spot. But there also might be even better moves like actually in this position, I might consider a move like a4. And the point is that now I'm threatening rook b1, and the queen almost can't come back home. And, let's say a move like bishop b7 is played. If I go rook b1, queen a3 is the only move, and then rook b3 traps the queen. And if you go after a4, if you go queen b4, then I just have discoveries on the queen with knight takes d5, and the queen is nearly trapped here, and not to mention the fact that knight c7 check is a threat. So because of those factors, it really seemed to me that the pawn was immune. And black agreed. He went back to queen c7. And now an interesting moment has arisen because on the one hand, by playing c5, I release the tension in the center, and black can be happy about that because he doesn't have to worry about this constant pressure on d5. On the flip side, I've taken more space, and I've done so with tempo. So my idea was that, space really matters, and so if I take up a lot of space, maybe it's okay that I release the tension. That was my argument. Now, but the thing that black is playing for now is because I've taken up space and closed my own pawn break. Now black would like to play for his own pawn break. And there are two breaks here. There's b6 challenging my pawn chain, and there's e5 challenging my pawn chain. Again, both moves challenge my pawn chain. I decided to stop the one I thought was most dangerous. I thought b6 was most dangerous, so I decided to play b4. The idea is just to reinforce this pawn break, get my pawns protected on this chain. I thought that made a lot of sense. But it does allow the other break on e5, and that's something that black needs to consider. Knight f6 was played, reasonable move, preparing to develop this other one to d7 because, again, black is lacking space, so his minor pieces are kind of tripping over each other. And I went bishop g2, just developing, keeping an eye on the e4 square so that perhaps a knight doesn't hop in there. And now e5. Victor took his chance, decided to play in the middle. Makes a lot of sense. I don't really want to take here because if I take here, I mess up my pawn chain a little bit and I give black the nice e5 square to play with. So instead, I decided to play f4, challenging this pawn and forcing it to make a decision. Black played e4, closing the center. And on the one hand, black is taking space, which is reasonable. But on the flip side, you could see my pawn chain is very, very nice, and I have space on both sides of the board. And now I can try and prepare for a queenside pawn break, so I thought I was in good shape. I went queen a4, trying to prepare that break with b5. Black went knight bd7, and now I went b5, and I thought I had a really promising position here because I have the two bishops, I have pawn tension here, and black really lacks space. The one thing I was worried about with pushing the pawns like this is that I was looking at potential sacrifices on c5. So I was really worried about whether black could get away with such a sacrifice. It doesn't quite work here, but it's something I was thinking about quite a bit later on. Because black is going to have to lash out in some way, I figured, to deal with my space. So after b5, black went bishop b7. I took on c6. and then went rook b1, and I thought this was nice. Now I'm controlling the one open file. My queen is eyeing this weak c6 pawn. I thought I was really doing a great job, and I was in business. Black castled. I castled, and note I only castled when black did because I wanted to see what black was doing with his own king and determine if it was safe to go to g1. Because in this position, if black kind of didn't castle, maybe the rook on the h file would be some pressure from my king. So I decided to just wait on that. But after castles, rook fb8. Now I felt pretty good because our kings are, in the same spot, and it seemed to me that I just have the two bishops and more space. Now again, the one thing I was worried about was sacrifices on the c5 pawn because all my pawns were on dark squares, and I thought that if, even though black gets only 2 pawns for the piece, I was really worried about some of my other pawns coming under fire. I went queen c2, which was in some respects a response to a potential sacrifice on c5. The point was that if there was such a sacrifice, I could challenge whichever piece lands on c5 right away with knight a4. Black went knight f8, which is a very interesting move, relocating this knight potentially to e6, still eyeing my dark square pawns, and maybe introducing the idea of g5 at some point. I'm not sure, but I thought it was an interesting plan. I decide I need to hurry on the queen side with my counterplay, and I went knight e2. The point was that I was still eyeing some of these pawns that are on dark squares that may be potential targets for sacrifices, and I was unleashing my bishop on this diagonal and preparing a maneuver we'll see in a few moves. Knight e6 was played. I went rook b3. I really like this move. The idea is to double on the rooks. If you've ever watched my series, Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew, I talk about the importance of keeping the tension on open files with your rooks. And one way to keep the tension and double on the rooks on the file is to use the pawn as an anchor. And now I'm using the a pawn as an anchor to get my other rook to the file. So that's a way to do it sometimes. Black played rook takes b3 because he didn't want to see me doubling. And I played a takes b3. And this was the idea, is that if you capture on b3, now my rook comes around and my pawn is now connected with my other pawns, and this a pawn might be a target. So I thought I had a really, really great position here, and honestly, I thought it was strategically winning. So I felt really good. But Victor's a very, very good defender, and I want to, give a shout out to his defensive skills in advance because he made it very, very difficult. Now I went queen b7. He needs to try and get some counterplay going before I, play rook a1, b4, etc. I went rook a1, again, putting the pressure on this a7 pawn. And again, all these endgames now are going to be very, very difficult for him because he has 2 weak pawns. He has a c6 pawn that's weak and the a7 pawn that's a little weak. And I have the bishop pair as a potential asset to work with. So very, very tough position. He went knight e8, now trying to develop a blockade on the b5 square. It's a reasonable idea. I went bishop e1, thinking about potentially maneuvering this bishop to g3 at some point and challenging on this diagonal. Knight c7, and now b4. And my idea now with b4 is my pawn chain. I have one nice long pawn chain, which is awesome. And now another idea is to maneuver this knight to the a5 square via c1, b3, a5. Knight b5, queen d2. The idea with queen d2 was just to reinforce the d4 pawn. Again, I could go knight c1 right away, but I was a little bit wary of sacrifices here. I just thought it would give black a lot of counterplay, and I didn't want to allow it. So I decided to just overprotect the d2 pawn before I went for knight c1. Bishop d8. Bishop f1. Now I'm training this bishop along this diagonal. Knight e7, and now knight c1. And you can see all my pieces now are trained towards the queen side, which is awesome. And I felt like I should have a pretty nice position here. Queen c8, knight b3, queen d7, and bishop g3. And bishop g3 was now an acknowledgement that, you know what, my bishop kind of had done its job supporting b4 here. Now I'm going to try and put it on a new diagonal. In hindsight, it might have been better to just stick the knight on a5 right away, just so that the queen would be tied to the d7 square. And in some positions, I'd even introduce the knight b5 idea, a knight b7 idea. But I mean, bishop g3 is not a bad move. But now f5 was played, and f5 kind of acknowledged that my bishop was maybe going to do something on this file, so he decides to play f5 and challenge this one. And I have a decision to make. I could keep the tension with bishop e2, and maybe that would have been the right choice. I went with bishop e2, but the point is that in a not-so-distant future, I decided to play g5 and close the center, and we're going to see whether that was good or not. Rook b8, king g2. Now I'm kind of improving, and the question is here, where's my breakthrough? Is my breakthrough coming on the A file, or is it going to come on the king side? Usually, the principle of two weaknesses is you create a little diversion on one side of board, and then you go to another side. So the idea was I was trying to create some type of confusion on both sides so that black has something to worry about. But, you know, Victor defended pretty well here. He played knight e8, which is a good move, trying to get the knight here and challenge this g4 pawn. And I didn't love the idea of the knight coming to f6, and then if I push g5, the knight coming to h5. I went king h2, and then knight ec7 was played. I was thinking with king h2 that my rook can now entertain this rook g1 idea. So I went rook g1 to try and, you know, just give black something to think about. Because I would love if black took on g4 for me, and then I'd have a lot of pressure on the g file. But he's not going to do that. Knight a3 is played. I think it's an interesting move, eyeing the c4 square. And I went queen c1. I did not want a knight to come into c4 because after knight c4, after a subsequent capture, then this knight would get the d5 square. So I didn't want to allow that. Then the knight went back. And now I went bishop e1 again. Again, still some maneuvering. Knight e6. King g2, still some maneuvering, just waiting. Queen f7, bishop d2. And again, when you are better, and especially in a position like this, it's important not to rush. That's another big principle. So I was trying not to rush, trying to give him things to think about, because I'm not spoiling the position move by move. But now he starts king f8, and he's like, you know what? I'm not going to sit tight. I'm going to try and improve my position a little bit. Maybe the king is going to go this way and protect the c6 pawn like this. Maybe the bishop is going to come over here and the rook's going to swing over. These were things to think about. And now when I saw the king on the run, I decided to play g5. The point was that now the king is a little bit airy. I thought maybe it's time to play for h5. And if the king runs over, maybe I switch back to the queen side. So g5 was a very committal move because it released the tension, and we can actually debate whether that was a good choice or not. I thought it was a good choice because I felt I still had a breakthrough here, but at the same time, maybe it wasn't. The one thing I was wary of in certain positions is this bishop coming to h4. So let's say I play a nothing move like queen b2. I was concerned in certain positions about bishop h4 because this bishop on this diagonal can be kind of annoying, and I can't evict it. So I can't push it away. So I was kind of worried about bishop h4 ideas. Although maybe it's not a big deal because if I close the center now, the bishop's actually trapped, and maybe there's some world where I can get a knight all the way to the g2 square and attack that bishop. It seemed kind of unlikely to me because to get to g2, though, you would have to go via the e1 square. That's the only square you could get through. So, and then the bishop could just snap it off. So, again, I was very unclear about whether I should be allowing this bishop h4 move, and that's another reason why I played g5. So anyway, g5 was a committal move, but I thought I should still be able to find a way to break through here. Black went king e8, running towards the queen side, and now I went h4, king d7, and now rook h1. And this was my idea, is to prepare h5 and now to play on the a file and the h file. And I thought that on one of those files, black would collapse from all the pressure. Black played king c8. I went queen a1, just eyeing the a file. Knight e c7, good move covering the a6 square because queen a6 was a threat. And now I went knight a5 because now that this knight moved away, now that this knight went to c7, the bishop can't eye the a5 knight, so I thought attacking this c6 pawn made sense. King d7 was played, defending it, and I felt here that there should be some type of breakthrough, just tactically. I was even looking at lines of like knight takes c6, king takes c6, and bishop takes b5. But funnily enough, after rook takes b5, there's still no breakthrough. I don't have any check here. I mean, I can take this pawn, but that's not enough. So there's no breakthrough yet. I went for h5 instead, trying to get something on the other side of the board. And after g takes h5, I went bishop takes h5. And the idea with playing bishop takes h5 was that I was thinking about maybe my bishop coming into g6 and hitting the f pawn. And I just kind of wanted to provoke black to playing g6 so that my rook would have the h file. So black went queen g8, not playing g6, which I think was a reasonable choice. But here it's, again, I feel like there's some way I should break through, and it was not unclear to me what that is. I went bishop e2 back, just arguing now I have the h-file, I'm in business. The move I wanted to play and I looked at, but I couldn't find a breakthrough, was bishop g6. Point being that I hit this f-pawn with tempo, but after queen e6, I didn't think my bishop could stay here. I mean, it's hit, and I didn't see where I could go. It didn't seem to me like bishop h7 was a good move because I blocked my rook on the file. So, yeah, I couldn't find a breakthrough, so I went bishop e2. Black went bishop e7. It's very important now that the rook tries to get involved before I double on the h-file. I went rook h5, doubling, trying to double. Black went queen e6, and then I went rook h7, attacking the g7 pawn. Black went rook g8, and now I went queen h1, and I thought, okay, now I'm getting somewhere. I have my rook and queen here. I still have my knight trained on the c6 pawn. This should be pretty good. And now black went g6, which I think is a good move, shutting down my bishop from potentially getting in the game later. I think it's a good move. I went queen a1 back, just teasing that I also have pressure on the a file. But one could argue that maybe it was time to infiltrate with rook h8. Point being that if you take on h8, now my queen could come maybe like through b7 to attack the c6 pawn, and maybe maybe I can attack like this. Another idea is maybe to put the queen on h7, and so this queen on e6 doesn't have moves. And then maybe I could prepare some bishop h5 sacrifice. But again, it's very difficult to break through as long as my bishop on d2 doesn't, get any squares to get in the game. So it really seems like I'm playing with three pieces here, and my bishop on d2 is not playing. After g6, I went queen a1. Black went rook b8. And then I went queen a2, eyeing the d5 pawn. Maybe thinking about going back to the a file and doubling like that. And now a6 was played, and a6 I thought was somewhat controversial because now the knight has to guard this pawn as well, but maybe it's a reasonable move. I'm not sure. I went queen a1. Again, now I thought, okay, my prospects on a6 aren't very good now that this knight is defending it. And I was just getting frustrated here that I wasn't breaking through. I have space on both sides of the board, but somehow black is holding on. He went rook g8 back. I went knight b3. And my idea here was now maybe my queen can actually come in via b6. Black went rook b8 back. I went king f2, just waiting. Rook g8. King e1. I can't explain this maneuver. I thought maybe my king would be going to c2 and then I could prepare the breakthrough, but king e1 is not a very good move because now I'm blocking the connection of my queen to h1. So if I wanted to start with that, if I wanted to do that maneuver, I should have put my queen h1 first. And you see this because now black plays rook b8, and after king c2 plays king d1 plays queen g8. And the point is, yeah, my king is getting to c2, but black is able to control the h-file. And this was a huge, huge mistake by me because it allows black to trade rooks. I went rook h6, but after queen g7, you could see now the rook is going to h8, and my queen cannot support that rook. Huge mistake. I just ceded the h-file for no reason. but it's also because I was impatient. I was tired of the fact that he was not getting broken down, and just a bad decision. I went queen a5 trying to justify, because this idea, because now I saw the rook was coming to h8, I was thinking, okay, maybe my queen can come into b6. Black played rook h8 anyway, and now I played queen b6, gambling a little bit because he was low on time, and so I was thinking, all right, I'm going to give up the h6 pawn, but I'm going to have knight a5, and surely the c6 pawn will drop. And so I was like, okay, I'm making headway here. This is good. This is good. But I totally missed an important detail, which is after rook takes, g takes, queen takes, and knight a5. I didn't play knight a5 right away. Black has g5. And the point is that the queen is actually defending horizontally on c6, and I don't have any breakthrough here. I played bishop takes b5 first, and after a takes b5, now I played knight a5. But the same problem exists, this g5 move. And here I realized that what I had done is I completely spoiled my position. I gave up my most active bishop. This light square bishop was the one that was constantly eyeing these weak squares that black had on the queen side. And now I'm saddled with a bishop that's very bad, and I don't have any way to infiltrate. So I really messed things up here, and the tide had turned completely. I took on g5 because I thought I can't allow g4 or g takes f4, and this pawn will just run. So I took like this. And after bishop takes g5, my position, I'm now a pawn down, and my position is totally collapsing. My bishop on d2 is a bad bishop, and I'm trying to get some counterplay here, but it doesn't look like it's promising. I went king c2 to at least get my king out of checks and temporarily stop bishop takes c3, because this trade would result in me being able to take on c6. But now black played queen g6, which is a really good move, just still eyeing the c6 pawn, and also looking at me trying, if I try to play a move like queen b8, black can play queen e8 and challenge my queen. I went king c3, just, pretty much waiting and defending. And now black went bishop h4 because now black can improve. So he's saying, you know what, I don't need to rush. And it's funny because he was much lower on time, but he was like, I don't need to rush now. I'm a pawn up. I can improve my pieces. I can maybe put my bishop here. I can think about putting my queen back here. I'm the one that has all the play now. I went queen b7, still keeping an eye on the c6 pawn and kind of waiting. And now black went bishop f2, and it's here that I realized what his idea was all along. His idea was to put the bishop on this perfect square on f2 and then break with f4. And when the pawn breaks on f4, if I take on f4, he plays e3 and e2 and e1 with tempo, because the e pawn hits my d2 bishop. And yeah, it's all of a sudden a position that was much better for me, close to winning, is losing. I went queen b8 trying to get some counterplay, but now f4 comes and it's just too fast. This threat is way, way too big. And the thing is, if I don't take it, he just goes f3 and has a protected pass pawn. I played queen h8 trying to desperately bring my queen back into the fray, but he took on e3. And the issue is that if I take on e3, I'm going to be in some problems. I mean, I took anyway, but after bishop takes e3, queen h3 check, I do recover the bishop, but black is still a pawn up, and it's a protected pass pawn, which is very difficult to defend. After knight e6, I took on e3, and now black played queen f6, and you can see now there are two threats. There's queen takes d4 that I have to worry about all the time, so my king is kind of paralyzed. And there's also queen f3 trying to trade queens. I played knight b3 trying to protect this pawn multiple times, and now black played queen h4, which is a nice move, not rushing to play queen f3, also controlling all the squares my queen could potentially go to get active, and just trying to take a lot of space before executing the queen trade. I went king b2 trying to hide my king on a3. But now black played knight f4, and now you can see the knight and the queen are excellent combination in attack. and this knight is eyeing d3. This queen might come in, and my queen is very, very defensive and just being blocked from doing anything. I went queen g1, again, trying to get active, and now black played a brilliant move that forces the trade of queens. If you want to pause the video and try and figure out what that is, it's pretty sweet. All right, Victor played queen f2 check. The point is that after queen takes f2, knight d3, there's this fork, and now he transposes to an ending where he's a pawn up with knights on the board. And the rule is in endings like this, actually, in knight endings, the rule is that knight endgames are like pawn endgames. So if you're a pawn up in a pawn endgame like this, it's winning. If there are knights on the board, it usually does not change the situation. So pawn endgames are knight endgames. So because of this endgame is totally lost. And the problem here is, again, the only way I can get counterplay is by eyeing the c6 pawn, but he can easily defend that pawn and march his own pawn up the board. So, we could just take a moment to enjoy or take a look at Victor's technique, because it's very, very straightforward. I went knight c1, king e6, king d2, knight d3, knight b1, knight a2. You see this knight is pitiful defending this b4 pawn. So my knight's tied down. King f5, king e3, king g4. And you see how the king is kind of outflanking my king for opposition. As long as this knight is tied to the defense of this pawn, you can't really make I can't really make a lot of progress defending, because my king is going to have to move out the way. I went king d2, king f3. And here, when I saw that, okay, now king f2 is happening, and then e3, e2, queen, I finally resigned. Very, very disappointing game for me. I could not tell you, I was actually pretty heartbroken, because I thought I had such a dominant position, and I got impatient, and because I got impatient, I made weak moves, and he was able to turn the tables. But that's what can happen sometimes when you're playing someone that's a very, very stout defender and you get frustrated. But I think the really big turning point in the game is when I tried to walk my king over from f2 to the king side when the queens were on the board, and I broke the connection of my queen and my rook on the h-file, which allowed him to trade rooks with rook h8 and neutralize my position. So just something to think about, that, when you're keeping the pressure on, you still need to make sure that they don't have counterplay, and you still need to be patient. And I just was not patient enough. This game was 80-something moves. It could have been 100+ moves if I was patient. And that maybe could have been the difference, because, again, when you're defending for a long period of time, usually you'll break at some point. But I was just not patient enough to let that happen. All right, well, thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Peace.